Muy buenos días. Para nosotros es un agrado tenerlos acá en esta primera jornada de la tercera conferencia anual COES, este Centro de Estudios de Conflicto y Cohesión Social, que está conformado por 4 universidades: la Universidad de Chile, que nos acoge hoy día, la Universidad Católica, la Universidad Diego Portales y la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. Para inaugurar esta jornada, directamente los voy a dejar con el señor Rector de la Universidad de Chile, don Ennio Vivaldi.
Hola a todos, saludo a las autoridades, veo aquí a Dante, a Daniel, a la profesora de Harvard que nos va a dar una clase magistral hoy día. En primer lugar, celebrar el contexto en el cual esto se da. Hemos hecho una cuestión muy central en la discusión sobre universidades, que las universidades son instituciones por su labor académica eminentemente de cooperación, colaboración, complementación, y por lo tanto es muy emocionante ver que en un problema como tan importante para el país y donde tienen derecho a existir tantas miradas en cuanto a fijar prioridades, estén unidas estas 4 universidades y, por supuesto, como siempre ocurre en el mundo de la academia por definición, no solamente está abierto al resto, sino que yo diría que el éxito en la academia es la medida en que uno pueda invitar, convocar, a ser relevante para otros. Por lo tanto, estas 4 universidades trabajando mancomunadamente y organizando aquí un evento que para nosotros es muy relevante y que tiene que ver con el posicionamiento del país en el mundo, que es otra cosa que también hemos venido insistiendo en el debate sobre universidades en Chile, que de alguna manera, entre que nos quedamos en la Guerra Fría, conceptualmente o no sé cuándo, pero como que la forma en que se ha dado la discusión sobre universidades en Chile difícilmente se compadece con los problemas que el mundo actual está abordando. Y creo que es también entonces muy importante la oportunidad de escuchar a personas del resto del mundo que vengan, sobre todo instituciones tan relevantes en esta área como son Harvard o la London School of Economics y otras que están aquí presentes en este debate. Quiero decir 2 o 3 cosas que creo que son tremendamente, para mí, han sido toda la vida, digamos, temas de reflexión y que de alguna manera tocan al tema que ustedes están viendo acá. En primer lugar, que los seres humanos, si algo somos, afortunadamente, y no podría ser de otra manera porque sería contradecir a la biología, es que somos muy distintos. Y afortunadamente somos muy distintos. Somos distintos físicamente, somos distintos en los caracteres psicológicos de cada uno. Y por eso que la idea de igualdad, que surge con tanta fuerza con la Revolución Francesa sobre todo, es una idea que no pretende negar lo obvio. O sea, o mejor dicho, hay un camino que el camino, digamos, de decir, no, si las diferencias son aparentes, lo cual, perdona, también es cierto en otro sentido. Eso también es cierto en el sentido de que lo único relevante en definitiva para juzgar a los seres humanos son sus valores éticos, lo demás es irrelevante. O sea, lo único que para uno es relevante cuando juzga a otro ser humano es cuáles son sus valores éticos. Pero volviendo a la idea de igualdad precisamente no es negar las diferencias, sino que precisamente por las diferencias, y ese es un desafío enorme para la civilización, precisamente por las diferencias que nosotros como seres humanos aceptamos que queremos que la sociedad se comporte sin hacer cuestión de esas diferencias. Eso significa igualdad de oportunidades, eso significa reconocimiento a cada uno de sus potenciales, la posibilidad de desarrollar sus talentos, y eso es central en la idea de igualdad. Precisamente la idea de igualdad surge porque somos distintos, de la misma manera que los tabúes nunca son tabúes de cosas, no hay ningún tabú en ninguna cultura que diga no comer piedra. Los tabúes son y apuntan a un tema que es central para cualquier convivencia humana. Pero creo que en este caso, yo creo que hoy día en Chile es particularmente importante el tema de la convención social. Porque lo que uno ve es una tremenda dificultad en el país por asumir valores e imponérselos al conjunto de la sociedad. Y parece más fácil entre la descalificación, la denostación, la queja, la rabia. Y es por eso que lo que ustedes están haciendo aquí es tremendamente constructivo y tremendamente oportuno en el día. Y es decir, ¿cómo hacemos para que esta sociedad, a pesar de las brutales desigualdades que hoy día observamos en ella, y conscientes del peligro enorme que para el futuro la sociedad tiene, la dinámica que esas desigualdades van a generar en la interacción entre los seres humanos que aquí estamos, cómo a pesar de eso nosotros hacemos un esfuerzo por reinstalar una idea de igualdad, una idea de justicia. Aprovecho, ya que estoy aquí, de celebrar en esta facultad los esfuerzos notables que la Facultad de Economía y Negocios ha hecho precisamente en un área tan importante y tan simbólica como es la educación, por incorporar a jóvenes que, de no ser por el esfuerzo que esta facultad ha hecho en sus múltiples programas, pienso en Oscar Landerrecht y muchos otros que han estado presentes, el mismo Dante, Daniel, tanta gente de esta facultad que ha estado presente en esos esfuerzos, que son como ejemplo, a su manera simbólico, de cómo uno combate, minimiza, revierte los efectos de esta desigualdad. Yo creo que si hay algún área, y valga, si se quiere, una observación recurrente, pero si hay alguna área en que la academia debe impregnar a la sociedad y la academia no se basta ni se satisface en el trabajo académico, sino que son obvias las implicancias sociales y políticas que el trabajo de la academia tiene, no se me ocurre una más decidora, más significativa que esta que los convoca a ustedes hoy día. Y no se me ocurre tampoco una forma más explícita de este esfuerzo de juntar a distintas universidades, convocar al mundo, a personas de gran relevancia hoy día en el mundo, a conversar esto y centrarlo en el Muchas gracias y le deseo una conferencia muy importante.
And I wish you a very nice and important conference.
Gracias, le cedo la palabra ahora a Dante porque me han dicho que tenemos que autopresentar. O heteropresentarnos.
Muy buenos días, señor Ennio Vivaldi, rector de la Universidad de Chile, señor Daniel Hochman, académico de la Universidad de Chile, investigador principal del COES y organizador de esta conferencia, autoridades universitarias, colegas, estudiantes presentes. Sean todos ustedes muy bienvenidos a la Conferencia Internacional COES 2015 de Desigualdades. Este evento es organizado por el Centro de Estudio de Conflicto y Cohesión Social COES y el International Inequalities Institute del LSE. Contamos además con el apoyo del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo. Esta conferencia internacional se enmarca dentro de las actividades más importantes que desarrolla nuestro centro y cuenta con el apoyo transversal de las 4 instituciones que conforman el COES: la Universidad de Chile, la Universidad Católica, la Universidad Diego Portales y la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, así como el financiamiento del programa FONDAP de CONICET. A mediados del 2006 y luego con más fuerza en 2011, todos vimos de qué manera movimientos estudiantiles, regionales, de minoría, etcétera, se instalaron en las calles de nuestro país, en los medios, en la política y en el quehacer cotidiano. Este fenómeno no fue solo nacional. Los indignados en España, diversas manifestaciones en el norte de África, Estados Unidos y Europa, daban cuenta de este fenómeno global. Como varios de ustedes recordarán, ese fue el tópico de nuestra primera conferencia internacional, legitimidad y acción colectiva. En aquella ocasión contamos con expertos en movimientos sociales, tales como Sidney Tarrow, Leslie McCall y Daniel Gagaxi. El año pasado nos preguntamos sobre el territorio como fuente de cohesión y conflicto. Urbanistas, geógrafos, sociólogos, economistas y actores de la sociedad civil nos acompañaron a reflexionar sobre la complejidad de estas relaciones y en esa ocasión contamos con destacados académicos como Tom Slater, Astrid Ulloa, Julio Dávila y Jamie Peck, entre otros. Hoy, en la Facultad de Economía y Negocio de la Universidad de Chile, los convocamos a reflexionar sobre la desigualdad, sus orígenes, determinantes, consecuencias y desafíos futuros. Como siempre, dicho trabajo se realizará desde una perspectiva interdisciplinaria. En efecto, entre hoy y el viernes 4 de noviembre, la conferencia entregará los espacios para analizar contemplar y debatir, contribuyendo al estudio de las desigualdades sociales, políticas y culturales en las sociedades democráticas del siglo XXI, con especial foco en las desigualdades de América Latina. Nos gustaría destacar la presencia de connotados académicos internacionales. Durante estos 3 días contaremos con las charlas magistrales de los profesores Michel Lamont, de Harvard University, Abdulmalik Simon, de Max Planck Institute, Ben Ross-Schneider, de MIT, y Mike Savage, de LSE. Contaremos con más de 70 panelistas nacionales e internacionales que participarán en las 12 mesas y 6 paneles que componen el programa. La conformación de dichas mesas y paneles no fue tarea fácil. Se recibieron más de 170 resúmenes y 12 propuestas de panel, los cuales fueron evaluados por un comité de expertos en base a su relación con las temáticas de la conferencia. En esta oportunidad, la conferencia cuenta con el Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo como socio estratégico, quienes han organizado 2 mesas de discusión en torno a las desigualdades de América Latina, las cuales tendrán lugar el viernes 4 durante la mañana. Asimismo, otra característica especial de esta conferencia es la presencia de un panel compuesto por representantes de la sociedad, quienes tendrán como tarea analizar el trabajo que realizan distintas organizaciones de la sociedad civil para promover los derechos y mejorar las condiciones de vida de ciudadanos históricamente excluidos. Finalmente, y no por eso menos importante, la conferencia contará con una sesión de póster al cierre de la jornada de hoy, donde 14 investigadores jóvenes expondrán sobre sus investigaciones en un formato visual que permite el diálogo con el autor en un ambiente más ameno. Como siempre, agradecemos el apoyo recibido y esperamos a través de este esfuerzo contribuir al desarrollo de las ciencias sociales del país. Esperamos que con esta conferencia ustedes sean intelectualmente desafiados, que emerjan nuevas preguntas y métodos para su correcta respuesta. Queremos ver en el futuro próximo nuevas contribuciones intelectuales que nos ayuden a entender mejor el fenómeno de la desigualdad y nos permita también contribuir con ideas para una sociedad más cohesionada, menos conflictiva, más meritocrática y también más desarrollada. Esperamos que disfruten esta conferencia y los invitamos a asistir y participar en todas las actividades a desarrollarse en estos días. Todas ellas están detalladas en el programa de la conferencia y en su sitio web. Muchas gracias. Queremos invitar ahora a la profesora Michel Lamont a dar la primera charla magistral con la cual se inaugura esta conferencia. Michel Lamont es profesor de Sociología de Estudios Africanos y Afroamericanos de la Cátedra Robert Goldman, profesor de Estudios Europeos de la Universidad de Harvard. Actualmente se desempeña como presidenta electa de la Asociación Americana de Sociología. También es directora del Centro Watershed para Asuntos Internacionales de la Universidad de Harvard y coeditora del Programa de Sociedades Exitosas del Instituto Canadiense para la Investigación Avanzada. La profesora Lamont es también autora de una docena de libros premiados y volúmenes editados, que incluyen estudios de límites de grupo, clase social, dinámica étnico-racial en Estados Unidos y Francia, cultura de excelencia en la educación superior, resiliencia social y neoliberalismo, repertorios culturales comparativos y evaluación de la investigación cualitativa en ciencias sociales. Dejo con ustedes entonces a la profesora Lamont para su charla inaugural. Muchas gracias.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this invitation. Buenos dias. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially since I'm extremely interested in the topics that are at the center of what is being done here. For the last 14 years, I've been co-director of a research program funded by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research called Successful Societies. It's an interdisciplinary program that brings together philosophers, political scientists, sociologists, geographers, and we are trying to look together at all the dimensions of what might define a successful society. So, of course, we have the least ethnocentric indicators, which would be low infant mortality and high life expectancy, There's also low social conflict, the question that concerns you here, social cohesion and solidarity. The part of the program that I'm most involved in is the one that has to do with social inclusion or recognition as a dimension of inequality. The program also involves someone like Will Kimlicka, who researches multiculturalism. And through my involvement in the Successful Society program, I've studied how to make group boundaries more porous. Having spent the first half of my career writing books on the drawing of group boundaries, more specifically in comparisons of the French and the American upper middle class and working class, looking at how moral arguments are used to draw racial and class boundaries on the two countries. I changed gears after my involvement in the Successful Society program, and I've become very interested in studying how ordinary people contribute to the transformation of group boundaries. Of course, we can study this by looking at laws, the role of social movements, of intellectuals in, for instance, destigmatizing people with HIV/AIDS. I have a paper that came out in the last issue of Social Science and Medicine, which looks at the process of destigmatization of the obese, people with HIV/AIDS, and African Americans. One can trace these processes historically, but the research I'm going to talk to you today is a research project that I've conducted with a group of collaborators. We started it with a meeting in 2006 where we decided that it would be a good idea to study how ordinary middle class and working class men and women go about contesting moments where they experience injustice, unfair treatment. And from this 2006 meeting, we came together as a group, that I'm going to describe the group to you in a second, and we decided to really study in a very micro-inductive fashion how people experience unfair treatment and how they go about responding to it. But more importantly, I would say, we came up with a research design that would allow us to explore what factors enable and constrains different kinds of responses in different places. And to the extent that your research center has a lot to do with space, you will see that spatial residential segregation figures quite prominently in the way that we think about the explanation. I'm going to start by describing to you briefly this table, which will allow you, as experts of inequality, to understand how we locate or how rather I locate our book in the broader field of research on inequality. So this is a little figure that I've put together based on when I started teaching the field of inequality many years ago. And basically, you have different processes that social scientists have documented concerning what produces inequality. So type 1 is basically Marx and Weber, the things that the dominants do to the dominated, which feeds into inequality. Exploitation of surplus value, domination, opportunity hoarding. In his book, Durable Inequality, Charles Tilly discusses many of these processes. They're generally top-down, things that bad people do to the powerless. The second type of process, you basically have Bourdieu, the development that came out of the theorization that emerged in the 80s, where symbolic resources are much more central to processes through which inequality emerges. The way in which, for instance, schools are applying standards that are middle-class standards to evaluate all children. And the third category is the one that I'm most concerned with today and in general now. It's developed in a paper titled What is Missing? Cultural Processes and the Making of Inequality. And what you notice here is that all these Asian identification, commensuration, standardization, evaluation, all these processes are ongoing processes that take place in everyday relationships that involve a very heavy dose of meaning making and that mobilize both the dominant and the dominated together. And it is ongoing, and it is open-ended in that these kinds of coordination of human action can or cannot result in exclusion, domination, inequality more generally. In this third process, I'm mostly interested theoretically in stigmatization and racialization, and that's what the talk of today is about. And I can come back to this in the Q&A if you want, because this is not fully developed in the book, but it's what I'm currently working on. So to introduce the book that I'm going to talk about today, I will read you a quote from the book. Basically, the book is based on hundreds and hundreds of incidents that we collected through in-depth interviews that were conducted in the New York suburbs, Rio de Janeiro, and Tel Aviv, with ordinary people who were randomly selected. They're not members of social movement. Activists, social movement participants are the object of an enormous literature. We don't deny the importance of the role of social movement in creating social change, but we want to put them in the background and highlight really what ordinary people do in response to injustice. So I'll give you this quote, which comes out of the American interview. So it's a middle-class African-American who finds himself with several white men in an elevator at work. And he describes what happens as follows. He says, "One of them made a joke about blacks and monkeys. I said, 'Man, listen, I ain't into jokes.' His demeanor changed, my demeanor changed. All of the positive energy that was in there was being sucked out because of the racial part. I told myself, get out of here, because if I stay in here, I'm going to be in that circle and I won't be able to get out. The stress level rose, my tolerance was getting thin, my blood pressure peaking, and my temper rising. By the grace of God, thank you, Jesus, as I stepped off the elevator, there was a black minister walking past. I said to him, can I speak to you for a minute, because I just encountered something that I got to talk about because I'm just this far from exploding. I had been at the job for only 2 weeks. This is all I need to get me fired. Now I'm trying to get through this affair to decide if I should go to the city to complain and sue them." So this is an example of the kind of data we have. For the US, we have over 700 such statements. We coded them extremely carefully to identify what kind of incidents is being described, where did it happen, what response was given, and also we coded what kind of thinking goes into the response. Okay, so those are the unit of analysis. And now that you know what kind of data because I don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to give you a lot of examples, empirical examples of this kind, but there's a great many, and I'm going to focus really on the overall findings of the book. At the most macro level, you're just going to have to buy the book if you want to have all the examples. And the book came out just a month ago or so. So what is wonderful here today is that one of my co-authors is in the room, and this is such a treat for me because it doesn't happen every day. Her name is Elisa Reich, and she's just there. Hi, Elisa. Probably many of you know her since she's one of the most prominent sociologists in Brazil. And any question you might have about the Brazil case, she's going to be very happy to answer them. Because I'm not the person. The book was co-written by 7 people, which involves 2 Brazilian experts, Elisa and Graziela Silva Moraes, who was until recently at the Federal University in Rio, has recently moved to the Graduate School of International and Development Affairs in Geneva. I co-led the U.S. part with Jessica Welburn, who now teaches at University of Iowa. And we have 3 Israeli co-authors, Nissim Mizrahi, Hannah Herzog, and Josh Gatzkow. Each of the themes, the book is organized around the U.S., Brazil, and the Israel chapter in this order, but we all co-wrote the papers, the books in multiple times to ensure that we would have an integrated framework. So here I have a problem reading in Spanish how to make this full screen, but I'll just move forward, I hope. Sorry? 5? F5. Okay, it's not working. F5. I cannot do it. I'm sorry, I'm kind of, you would think this is universal. I'm a Mac person, so I'm very handicapped when it comes to non-Mac. Okay, great. So I just want to say a word about this book cover because I'm very proud of it. You will see very quickly that the concept of groupness is central to our analysis. Here you have the dots of different colors that represent diversity. We study 3 multi-ethnic societies, but we also study 5 groups that experience different degrees of groupness. And these little gray crowds that you see are these groupness. It's an artwork of an Indian artist. So the objective of the book are first and foremost to understand what is the subjective experience that feeds into the allostatic load that epidemiologists have written a lot about, which explains racial disparities in health. The members of stigmatized group experience in their daily life, as their daily life unfolds, a great many moments of discrimination and stigmatization, and these feed into the wear and tear of everyday life that has been used to explain differences in racial disparity. So that's the general, scholarly purpose of the project. We also have some political goals. One of them in the U.S., as many of you probably know, 76% of white people live in a context where they never interact with black people or with any other minority group. So the goal is in part to produce a book that can inform on what does it mean on a daily basis to be part of a stigmatized group. What kind of internal dialogues people have as they are deciding how to deal with incidents that come their way. We also, in the American context, especially in a moment such as this one where we have constant mobilization around issues of recognition, denaturalize what is the African American experience. Most Americans don't learn geography anymore. They barely know, I'm Canadian, so I'm going to say bad things about Americans. They barely know that other countries exist. So it's very easy for African Americans to forget that there are only one stigmatized group on the planet. There are many others. And what colors the experience of stigmatized group has not been fully studied in a comparative perspective. So the book truly tries to innovate by looking at blackness in 3 different national contexts. I'll explain to you how we do this. There's this book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, that was a major bestseller this year in the US, which is a black man explaining to his son what it means to be black. So there's an enormous need. One of the MacArthur Award Fellows this year is a poet who wrote about the experience of blackness. So there's a great need there that we're trying to address, although our book, unfortunately, is really a scholarly book with tons of footnotes. So it will not be a bestseller, but hopefully it will engage our colleagues in the social sciences and will incite everyone to try to move the literature on race and inequality in slightly different directions. Another intervention is really to understand the factors that enable and constrain experiences and responses. So this is extremely different from doing randomized controlled trials. The approach to explanations that we adopt is really one that is grounded in the Weberian tradition of Verstehen, where we're really reconstructing the context in which people live to understand what kind of push and pulls can help us understand why African Americans confront, as soon as they experience racism, Arab Palestinians don't. So that's our question. What kind of responses do we find where and why? And finally, we bring what we believe are needed corrective to the literature on racism. Basically, we're proposing that we need to move away from a study of discrimination, which is about how people get or do not get things, housing, education, work, but also that we try to study much more systematically the experience of stigmatization. We have this classical paper by Nancy Fraser on inequality, which is fed by both distribution and recognition processes, but there's very little empirical sociology that teaches us how to do this. And that's one of the main drivers of the book. Let's try to study how people claim recognition. Let's try to study stigmatization processes, because we find that stigmatization is way more salient than discrimination when you interview stigmatized group about what it feels to be treated unfairly. And the explanatory goal is really here. We draw on a recently published edited volume by James Mahoney and Kathleen Thielen, where they argue that we should adopt configurational approaches to explanation, which is the kind of approach that we develop with a focus on 3 different types of explanatory elements, which are cultural repertoires. Those of you who are not cultural sociologists may not know what cultural repertoires are. They are basically the cultural toolkits that are in our environment on which we can draw to make meaning of our lives. This is a very different approach to culture than cross-cultural analysis which normally considers national cultures in a very essentialist and internally coherent way. There's been a huge shift, a field through which I've made my reputation as a field of cultural sociology, which rejected Parsonian approach to culture to focus instead on this focus on meaning making, more influenced by Goethe, with the huge emphasis on how cultural repertoires are used. I have a paper with Mario Small and David Harding, which spells out what are the analytical tools of this approach, which includes notions of symbolic boundaries, narrative, repertoire, frames, institutions, habitus, etc. So it's on the literature. It's a critique of the literature on culture and poverty, which is written for economists, demographers, epidemiologists, not for sociologists. It's very didactic. So if you have no exposure to this literature, you might want to look at it. The concept of groupness is borrowed. It's an old concept in sociology, but over the last few years it's been resurrected by Roger Brubaker in a classical paper with Cooper, 2000 Theory and Society, where he says, let's stop studying identity, let's study identification, and let's look at how groups gain groupness, which is the idea of the internal coherence that a group has. Whereas he simply proposes it, we operationalize it. So that's another contribution of the group. So here, this is basically the dimensions that we're using to explain the outcomes. I'm just flashing this in your face, not expecting that you can read it because it's much too small, but I'm going to be spelling out for you as I move forward how we mobilize some of these elements. So just to highlight quickly, the cultural repertoires include national myths, Zionism, American dream, racial democracy. It also includes empowering ideologies such as black nationalism, but it also includes neoliberalism, which is a cult in human rights. These are transnational cultural repertoires that influence what happened where. And the historical, socioeconomic, and institutional elements include the degree of spatial segregation that you have in each country that separates non-stigmatized group from majority groups. It includes the size of the group and other dimensions. So who do we compare? We started with the idea, kind of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis-inspired approach to look at, I'm Canadian, right? And I know that in Canada we have many, many words to talk about snow because we spend so much time in snow. You could not understand the subtleties with which one can distinguish various mixes of mud and snow, for instance. And this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis says the deeper and the more intense is your experience with a phenomenon, the more complex and elaborate the classifications code you have to operate with it. Similarly, our starting hypothesis was that in societies where racism is experienced frequently and intensely, ordinary people will have a much more extensive vocabulary to talk about their experience. That's what we started with. It didn't work like this at all. What we ended up doing through very detailed inductive analysis of these interviews is to discover that, in fact, they mostly talked about different kinds of experiences. It's not that the vocabulary was more or less intense. The first meeting around the project was in 2006, included not only the 3 cases we ended up with, but also it included the case of Quebec, the case of France, the case of Ireland. We ended up with those 3 cases, which we thought would work pretty well, because of course Brazil is renowned as a case where group boundaries are fairly flexible, there's less spatial segregation between groups, there's more intermarriage, although we all know that there's a strong concentration of black Brazilians at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And of course the Israel case is one where you have checkpoints, where you have war, where you have instant conflicts. So we didn't know where the US would fall within those 3, within this axis of very strong and fluid symbolic boundaries. In the Israel case, although we started wanting to only analyze the main victim of racism in each of the 3 countries, focusing on Arab Palestinians in the Israeli case, as the project evolved, we decided to have 3 groups in Israel. We added Ethiopian Jews because we decided it would be really productive to have blacks in each of the 3 countries. And we added Mizrahim because Mizrahim are Jews from the Middle East, people whose parents immigrated from Yemen and Iraq, who are also concentrated at the bottom of the labor market, but who think of themselves as highly assimilated. So it's a weakly bounded group. And as our project moved forward, we decided it would be very helpful to have two weakly bounded groups, the other weakly bounded group being Black Brazilians. And this conceptualization really emerged after we had analyzed most of our data, so I'll come back to it in a minute. We have also two strongly bounded groups, which in our analysis ended up being Arab Palestinians and African Americans. But our hypothesis is that not that the more tightly or weakly bounded group each group is, the more elaborate or the more confrontational they are. Not at all. You will see it's not linear at all, which is one of the interesting findings. So given that you are from Chile, you might wonder, okay, we have a very large literature comparing racism in the U.S. and Israel, in the U.S. and Brazil. Is this simply one more of these studies? We have the classics, you know, Anthony Marx's book, the debate between Bourdieu and Wakan Lounge. We think of our study as quite different. A lot of the other studies are basically located more at the state policy level. We're looking at micro experiences, and we're not doing the usual focus on how Black Brazilians are alienated and suffer from lack of racial consciousness. In fact, what we're doing is looking at how they're articulating their racial consciousness. And we're doing a comparison between classes and within classes and across genders as well. And we find stronger differences between the middle class and the working class in Brazil, much more than in the US. So, and the question of what does this Israeli comparison brings in, I mentioned Ethiopians as the third group of blacks, but in their case, their exclusion is not at all based on their phenotype, as one might have expected. In fact, in their case, they are stigmatized for a whole range of different reasons that I'll explain in a minute. The case of the Mizrahim is partly interesting because of the powerful myth of integration in Israel, Zionism, which says that everyone who's Jewish belongs there. And despite the context of very strong inequality, they tend to downplay their stigmatization and emphasize assimilation. And the case of Palestinians we thought was going to be partly interesting since they are excluded due to their national identity, and they do not confront as much. So the method, we have 150 interviews of randomly sampled people. We identified using census tracts people who fell in the college-educated professionals and managers on the one hand, low-collar, low-status white-collar workers and blue-collar workers in the U.S., in the New York suburbs, send them letters, had a survey company call them, see if they would be willing to participate. And then we had in-group members, racial in-group members, should I say, go interview them. They were Harvard graduate students, so not necessarily class in-group members. But we had these very strong degree of integration in the research across the three sites. Interview protocols that overlap at 90%. Same thing with the coding scheme that we developed inductively in coordination using Atlas TI. So all these interviews in Brazil and Israel and the US were analyzed with a great deal of care and detail using Atlas TI. The analysis of the data in Israel was a little bit less systematic. So what are our findings? There's great many of them. So I'm going to describe to you what we found in the US using this table. So we coded all the instances of being treated fairly that they talked about. To our great surprise, mostly what they talked about was being what we came to call assault on dignity, being overlooked, ignored, misunderstood. I'm at work. No one ever confirms anything that I say. I'm always by myself. I walk in the lounge of teachers in the morning. No one says hi to me, being ignored. So these experiences are endless, are, extremely hurtful. And when people talk about them, they do talk a lot about old forms of blatant racism, Being insulted and disrespected is the most frequent, as you can see, in the US. And the second most frequent is being misunderstood. You know, people think you're threatening when you're not at all threatening. People think you're disrespectful when you don't think you're being disrespectful, etc. The lack of third party when you are token, who would confirm to you your interpretation of reality, is something that is extremely recurrent. Discrimination, as I mentioned earlier, is about not having access to things, kind of things that can be documented through audit studies. Unfortunately, stigmatization cannot be documented through audit studies because the dominant party typically does not agree that stigmatization is occurring. It doesn't mean that it's not occurring. So middle class and working class you have at the top, having written 2 books on the French and the American middle and working class before doing this project. We had tens of many hypotheses about expected class differences before we started. Very few of them worked. The differences in the US between the middle class and the working class are very few. The main differences is that the middle class expects that having a college degree should give you more dignity and respect. In fact, it doesn't. So they're very shocked to see that they are often presumed to be low status, poor, and uneducated. And we did the interviews in 2008, just at the time when Obama was being elected. Now more Americans are aware that the black middle class exists. But at the time that we did the interview, it was not the case. So basically, the racial identity overshadows the social class identity for most of these respondents. There's a few elements where the working class mentions incidents more often, for instance, experiencing double standards, given that their work conditions involves much closer control. At the level of experiences in the other sites, basically, for black Brazilians, the most frequent kind of experience by far is being stigmatized as poor and uneducated, which is not surprising given that Brazil is a particularly is characterized by a very high level of class inequality. Among Arab Palestinians, they experience a lot of blatant insults, and they're often suspected to be the enemy within, in cahoots with Palestinians. The kind of incidents that they experience are unambiguous, and they very rarely say that they were misunderstood. Even this question simply didn't make sense for them at all, because they don't expect to be understood in any way. So they believe that if there's a solution one day to the Israelo-Palestinian conflict, it will be achieved at the international level, involving the UN, not through interpersonal negotiation. For Ethiopian Jews, they experience some stigmatization based on their skin color, but much more salient are the cultural stereotypes as primitive, culturally backward, poor, lazy, and violent. And the Mizrahi Jew most often talk about experiences that other people they know have experienced. They never say that they have experienced it themselves. They think that they themselves behave in such a way that they deserve the respect of others. So, and they talk about things of the past. And what we have found when we look at responses to stigmatization, we find also quite important differences. We analyze inductively all the responses that were mentioned, categorize them in these 5 groups. You know, we started with Albert Hirschman, exit, voice, and loyalty, and found that in fact things were much more complicated than that. Confrontation is generally the most salient response. In the United States, it's used almost twice as often as any other types of responses. The law is particularly salient in the US, much less because in the US people like to sue each other, much less so in the other sites. The second category, management of the self, is really about all the times that people put into thinking about what would be the appropriate responses and what kind of penalty they might suffer from confronting. So typically someone experiences an incident and then she thinks, do I want to be the angry black woman again today? No, I want to be the respected lawyer and I have some long-term goal, therefore I will shut up and simply put up with this. Well, that's not at all the same thing as not responding. Not responding, they don't respond, they say, here you see the subcodes. I didn't respond because I was so surprised that I just didn't think about how to respond, or I was hungry, I wanted to eat my dinner, therefore I decided not to make a stink. So you can see that in the US the main kind of response is confrontation, with not responding and management of the self being second in importance. Much less important is competition work, which surprised us, because when it comes to normative responses, the idea of self-improvement, of getting your education, of being upwardly mobile, of becoming a professional is far more salient. These individualist responses that are fed by neoliberalism are far more salient. We had a battery of questions which was around what kind of incidents have you experienced, describe to us what happened, and another set of questions that have to do with what are the best tools that your group has at its disposal to respond to racism. What do you teach your kids about how to respond to racism? What are the best responses? So those we call normative responses or idealized responses. And we compare both the individual response that emerge in response to specific incidents to these normative response, and they're quite different. One of the main differences in the US being that the normative response are very much focused on self-improvement, individual improvement, which is very puzzling in the context of what followed with Black Lives Matter. I can address this later if you wish. So we had the hypothesis about the middle class being much more confrontational than the working class. They are, but not very much. So I could go into more details about the differences. The responses in Brazil, in Israel, in compared to the US, is that in Brazil, confrontation is not more salient than management and no response. The big difference, I think, is that in Brazil, they are much more hesitant about labeling an incident racist unless, you know, a reference to race is very explicitly made. You know, my Brazilian co-authors talk about unless race is named. So at the beginning of the book, we mentioned the case of a prostitute who arrived, no, sorry, a woman lawyer who arrived at her hotel late at night, dressed very nicely. She asked the clerk, she gives the clerk her room number. Instead of giving her the key, he takes the phone, calls the room, and he says, "I'm sorry, he's not there," and he winks, obviously thinking she's a prostitute. And she's extremely insulted and upset, but she does not confront him because he did not say anything that is explicitly racist. In the American context, one could easily imagine an African-American woman starting to yell at him. In the Brazil context, she thinks it is not appropriate to do so for a range of reasons that we describe in the book as enabling this kind of non-response, which I'll describe in a second. In the Arab-Palestinian case, typically they ignore incidents because they don't expect any change, and they have no hope of being understood. The Ethiopian Jews and the Mizrahim both have assimilationist strategies. Ethiopian Jews will try to educate the ignorant, to explain to them who they are and why is it that they are good Jewish people, just like the Arab immigrants, and that they hope to assimilate one day, just like the Russian immigrants have. So very different responses. So the Israeli chapters makes the point that phenotype is not the primarily principal organizing exclusion in Israel, it is nationality. The main group being excluded are the Palestinians, and national belonging is what drives their exclusion. And the level of groupness, most importantly the position of the group vis-a-vis the polity, plays a major role in shaping experiences and responses to stigma. So this doesn't make any sense in the American case, because of course African Americans are full members of the American polity. It doesn't mean at all that they're integrated. So here you already have one of the keys to the contribution of our book, which is to say the principles of inclusion and exclusion vary drastically, and you can study them from the micro perspective. So then we turn to trying to explain our findings, and the first conclusion we reach is it's much more complex than the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And we focus on the role of groupness in shaping responses, which is when something happens, with how much certainty can they know that their experience is being driven by racism, for instance. And that has to do with the degree of groupness. And we also talk about the centrality of these repertoires in feeding some kinds of responses versus another. So what is this concept of groupness? Well, it is about really how tight a group is and how salient is it to the understanding of the members of the group. So typically in the literature and psychology, Tashfeld and Turner, for instance, group positioning theory, people think about in-group and out-group, something that happens largely in the head, although they talk about the context as well. And they talk about this as tied to human nature, essentially. We have a natural predisposition toward valorizing people like us and downplaying people who are not like us. We don't deny the importance of status hierarchy as a social dynamic, but we understand it very differently. We think some of this is driven by self-identification and self-labeling, but a lot of it is fed by the cultural repertoires that are available around you. In the African-American case, the fact that you have scripts about the history of the group that is constantly being reenacted, reproduced, restated in public entertainment, in music, etc., means that blackness is just extremely central to the group, and it's very politicized. The salience of national identification is lower. African Americans identify first as black, second as African Americans. Not so in Brazil, where national identification is more salient than racial identification. But it's not only about identity, it's also about group boundaries as they manifest themselves at the ground level, whether or not you live in a context where groups encounter each other. The Brazil context, where you have high level of homophilia in friendships, high level of intermarriage, low level of spatial segregation, is totally different from the American case, where those three dimensions are very, very low. Low homophilia, low intermarriage, very high spatial segregation. So who you interact with on a daily basis makes a huge difference in what the symbolic boundaries have to look like, symbolic boundaries being how we represent the other group to ourselves, the social boundaries, which are the patterns of intermarriage and residence, and spatial boundaries as well, which is the distribution of groups in space. And here, under symbolic boundaries, we talk about whether they think that the dominant group is vile or not. You know, in the American case, we find a lot of statements that are very anti-white, which you don't find in Brazil to the same extent. And you have repertoires of group disadvantages and shared experience that are more or less evenly available across cases. So we have this table that, describes the level of groupness for our 5 groups in terms of self-identification and group boundaries. And since you probably cannot read very well, this is what we conclude. In the US, you have very strong groupness, but it is contradictory because they live in an environment where you're supposed to be universalistic. You cannot say, I only want to have black friends. If you do that, you're viewed as bigot and as racist as a black person. So they will say, my closest friends are black, but I espouse universalistic norm. In Brazil, we argue that you have blurred boundaries because on the one hand, many of them, a growing number of them, self-identify as Negroes. They have a more politicized understanding of their group identity. But at the same time, the notion of racial mixture really pushes them away from having strong group boundaries. And you have the other factors that you find here: strong self-identification as group members, weak perceived cultural distinctiveness, since black Brazilian culture is largely Brazilian culture, etc., and low level of spatial segregation and all that. Sorry, I just lost my place. Okay, in the case of Israel, you have very strong groupness. In Israel, it is, Ethiopians, you have this dissonant experience, since on the one hand, they want to be strongly assimilated. On the other hand, they are very excluded. And in the Mizrahi case, you have very weak groupness. So the book at the end, here I'm going to have to rush since I've been talking for too long, but what we're doing at the end is assemble all the explanations that feed into these patterns of responses that I've been talking about. And these explanations have to do you have at the bottom the cultural repertoires that enable very different responses. So if in the Brazil case, for instance, you have a notion of racial democracy or, neoliberal responses, neoliberal repertoire being less salient, it will feed much less a response that would be based around self-improvement than it is the case in the United States. So we kind of, retrospectively look at the patterns of responses that we find in our 3 countries and 5 groups and try to look at how these factors that we have identified may help us explain why we find some responses in some groups rather than others. With, for instance, Zionism explaining the lower salience of confrontation in Israel, etc. So where does this leave us? Well, I'll just focus on the Israel case since I don't have time to look at all of them. But we argue that Arab Israelis experience a great deal of alienation, which is coupled with residential and institutional segregation, but it feeds into a strong sense of national groupness. So this explains the fact that they confront less. Ethiopians have dissonant racial groupness. They want to become insiders as Jewish Israelis, despite their conspicuous phenotypical distinctiveness. And the Mizrahim have a weak sense of ethnic groupness, reject narratives of group distinctiveness, and embrace Jewishness. So this is all very different from what we find in the US, where the prime response is confrontation. And we argue that this confrontation is primarily enabled by the great salience of the civil rights legislation, which means that even, and this is very clear in the context of Black Lives Matter, even as they are experiencing police profiling, etc., they feel extremely entitled to contest the current situation and to push towards social change, even at the personal cost. So here, this leaves us with, and this is the paper that develops these notions of the various paths that I described earlier. So what is the agenda for the study of inequality that comes out of our book? There are several. One of them is really to develop a much more fine-tuned understanding of the relationship between symbolic, social, and spatial boundaries, which is one reason why I was so pleased to hear that your center here has a very strong emphasis on spatial analysis in tackling questions of social inclusion. There's also the question of recognition, which I mentioned earlier. So I am thinking about, for instance, looking at various kinds of policies of how could societies diffuse messages about inclusion that are much more salient. Policymakers typically think in terms of distribution. The old example of food stamps, the policy has been revised, but nevertheless the example holds. When such redistributive policies are put in place, policymakers never ask themselves what is going to be the impact of policies on stigmatization, on reproducing stigmatization, on low-income people, on African Americans. So if policymakers, people like us, social scientists as well, were much more conscious of stigmatization as a central part of processes of inequality, it would make a huge difference. We've had Piketty on questions of distribution and health and wealth. How about a similar book that would talk about what is the impact of stigmatization? A lot of the literature is more focused on decrying injustice and not studying cultural processes. So I think that what we need to aim at as social scientists today is really to consider much more systematically what kind of policies can be put in place to lead toward destigmatization across a number of dimensions. So I think I could develop more on this and other aspects of, what are the implications of the book to consider racial formation. If we think of the classic books like Omi and Wyden on racial formation, which was largely inspired by Gramsci, I think we need to move toward much more fine-grained understanding of processes of inclusion and exclusion beyond these kinds of big, massive, resistance theory inspired by Marxism. And my hope is that by focusing through very fine-grained analysis on such processes as those, cultural processes, as those listed here along the line of what we develop in this article, we might be able to make some progress. And as the president of the American Sociological Society, American Sociological Association, I'm convening in Montreal the annual meeting in August, and the theme of the meeting is culture, inequality, and social inclusion across the globe. And I know that several people in the room are planning to attend, but I want to extend to you an invitation to everyone to attend, because I think it's very important that American sociologists engage in a dialogue with sociologists around the world. I think that it's easy when you're an American sociologist, given the huge size of this discipline, 12,000 people, it's very easy for American sociologists to study poverty and inequality, to never be aware of how it exists elsewhere. And I think we have a great deal to learn from interacting with colleagues from other countries and from Latin America in particular. So I urge you to join us. Thank you.
Para continuar con esta presentación vamos a iniciar una ronda de preguntas. Tenemos un par de minutos antes del café. Las preguntas pueden ser en español o en inglés. Si es que son en español va a haber traducción, y si son en inglés, bueno, Michelle va a responder directamente. Acá.
Está bien. Hola, buenos días. Encuentro súper interesante el tema de las desigualdades y me parece muy bien, además, el incorporar el tema del pueblo palestino. Pero más que una pregunta, yo quisiera hacer en realidad un alcance. Me parece que el problema que hay en la entidad sionista de Israel debería tratarse de manera diferente a los otros países, porque todos sabemos de que es un Estado que se implantó en base al terrorismo y en base a la usurpación de la tierra de los nativos palestinos. Entonces, comparar a los nativos palestinos que viven en un apartheid y el resto estamos exiliados en una diáspora sin retorno, creo que es diferente el tratamiento a los africanos, negros, de religión judía que han emigrado, ¿no es cierto?, a la Palestina histórica. O sea, a mí me interesaría mucho hacer ese hincapié, que debe ser tratado de manera diferente, porque el pueblo palestino está sometido hasta el momento a una limpieza étnica, en donde se ha superado 3 veces, o pocos decir 3 veces, lo que hizo el nazismo con los judíos. Creo que eso es muy importante.
Bien. We're going to collect some questions. So, thank you very much for your questions.
Well, why don't I respond to this one first? Because it's a very, as soon as you talk...
Okay.
Okay. As soon as we talk about Israel, of course, it always becomes extremely divisive. People have very, very strong position on this. So I don't want the conversation to be about this. I've experienced it before when I gave talk. Many African Americans would argue that what they've experienced in terms of slavery, extermination, genocide is certainly as violent as what has happened to Palestinians, and Black Lives Matter as sort of the huge movement of solidarity
en Palestina. Me estoy escuchando a mí misma. No estoy escuchando los micrófonos, lo siento. Hubo un problema en la mesa de sonido y me estoy escuchando a mí misma. No se escucha a la
experiences and how they respond to it. The sampling scheme was simply to take groups that are widely recognized as having experienced exclusion in their society.
A ver, estamos contra el tiempo, así que vamos a recolectar un par de preguntas. Les ruego que sean súper precisos y precisas para hacer las preguntas, de tal manera de facilitar las respuestas posteriores.
Ahora, muy breve, Luis Reigadas de México. En varios de tus trabajos has analizado cómo las fronteras simbólicas se convierten en fronteras sociales. Ahora que estás analizando la desestigmatización, procesos tipo, ¿cómo está cambiando? La pregunta sería, ¿cómo al cambiar las fronteras simbólicas y los procesos culturales de la desigualdad, se convierte eso en menor desigualdad social, o si no has analizado el proceso contrario, digamos, cómo la igualdad o procesos de desestigmatización en lo cultural se traducen en igualdad social.
I suppose my question kind of follows on from that one. My whole work is around class stigmatization and the way that poor working class people are constantly stigmatized. I'm often asked, you know, what policies could we put in place? I'm always asked this, and I suppose really I'm going to ask you, you know, how can you see that policy could, you know, policy from above could change this? Because my answer is always, you know, there's nothing from above that could change sort of the way that people discriminate and stigmatize other people.
Sí, se escucha, ¿no? Sí, una pregunta acerca del análisis espacial del cual usted habló. Usted habló acá de límites simbólicos, symbolic boundaries, pero también existen límites, también se refirió a límites espaciales. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿de qué manera el diseño de las ciudades, el diseño de los espacios, puede favorecer o limitar la interacción y reducir la segmentación y segregación?
Okay. I'm sorry, too many things. Okay, so the first question
La
was
primera
about,
pregunta
how do we
hacía
go
referencia
from destigmatization
a la desestigmatización y la mejoría en la distribución de recursos. No se trata solo de ayudar a las personas que se sientan mejor, pero también cómo el sentirse mejor y no estigmatizado nos lleva a un mejor acceso a cosas. Bueno, yo lo responderé esto diciendo que la estigmatización existe a nivel de repertorios institucionales, entendiendo que esto está sumamente cristalizado y se toma por sentado. El hecho que una mujer no podía entrar al ejército era un dado, ¿verdad? Y todavía sigue siéndolo así en muchas partes. El modelo con el cual estamos trabajando aquí hace referencia a que las interacciones contestan o antagonizan a su grupo como grupo inferior en varias dimensiones. Entonces, las múltiples intervenciones diarias de feminismos que está insertando agujeros en la realidad diaria puede apalancarse en forma individual, pero es alimentado por movimientos sociales que trabajan conjuntamente con el trabajo de los cientistas políticos y sociales y la ley para transformar la realidad. Entonces, el documento sobre la estigmatización, por ejemplo, los que tienen VIH afroamericanos, hablamos ahí, por ejemplo, que los expertos médicos y sociales, científicos y movimientos sociales, los organizadores y personas comunes y corrientes han jugado un rol conjunto para generar estas personas que contienen esta enfermedad, son peligrosos, etcétera. Y esto también tiene una discriminación a nivel de relaciones, de empleo. Discutimos que la construcción social de un grupo es un hecho social, no solamente el reino de ideología, pero se alimenta en las políticas públicas y en acceso público. En muchas formas no se trata solamente de hacer que las personas se sientan mejor, es mejor sentirse mejor, pero se traduce finalmente en accesos más amplios. La segunda pregunta, entonces, hace referencia y está muy relacionada a la primera. Hablé, por ejemplo, de las estampillas de alimentación, pero también tenemos otro tipo de recursos donde las personas realmente pueden ir a la caja y pagar sus alimentos con algo que es digital y que no sea visible. Y esto es muy importante, en lugar de estar pagando con estampillas que se nota que son de acceso social. Estoy de acuerdo con usted que el blanco pobre obviamente tiene ese lado, y eso está en este documento. Pero la discusión con respecto a este documento es que los pobres son una categoría tan estigmatizada en Estados Unidos que y nadie está realmente apoyándolos, nadie está realmente teniendo un sistema para apoyarlos. Pero el afroamericano tiene un sistema muy exitoso, tienen un aparato legal, intelectual, cientistas políticos que están apoyándolos diariamente. Los pobres son realmente los que se dejan de lado. Con respecto a los aspectos simbólicos de esto, a los cuales se estaba refiriendo, tanto a nivel social, yo no soy un experto, pero cómo hablar de este aspecto simbólico. Lo que yo estoy aprendiendo, tengo muchos colegas sociólogos, el señor Ramson, David Hardy, ellos han trabajado en ese tema. Hay un interés creciente con respecto a las dimensiones simbólicas de la vida social y también de la vida urbana, y con las cuales yo estoy familiarizada con Dante, pero realmente no he trabajado en este tema. Tengo estudiantes en la universidad que están hablando de esto, pero no les puedo dar una respuesta formada con respecto a esa pregunta. Very well, then. We are on time. We'd like to invite you all to a coffee break now. If you'd like to ask more questions to Michelle, you will have time to do so at the coffee break. We would like to give Michelle a great hand for her presentation. Thank you. Coffee break is on the left-hand side, and the meeting will be separated in 2 rooms. María José Álvarez from Universidad de los Andes is going to be here. Social and spatial inequalities.
Y luego la sala 301, que queda justo arriba, Juan Pablo Luna va a estar a cargo de las élites en contextos de alta desigualdad.
Hola a los miembros de la comunidad COES, los invitamos a pasar adelante para una foto oficial con los invitados.
De final.